Hello. The IRPs are a fairly rich resource. They contain a lot of information that's potentially helpful to a new educator. There are also some areas of the IRPs that need improvement and that seem somewhat restrictive. We will cover the positive attributes first. The IRPs provide very solid guidelines showing you what you need to cover. They are also a nice condensed package of resources with helpful guidelines and outcomes. I like to think of them as a stepping stone, which shows a really clear first step as to how to put your unit plans together and develop lesson plans from there while following the proper PLOs for your class. And the IRPs also help with accountability. It's easy to go back with your employer or with a parent and say, here's what I covered in class and here's how that relates back to the PLOs that are contained in the IRP. One of the greatest features of the IRPs is that it allows a new educator or a very experienced one to incorporate resources from all over the world. It's very easy to take a lesson plan from Kenya or Cambodia and modify it to make sure that you're meeting the PLOs for BC learners, and then to teach that to your great class in British Columbia. In this way, the BC IRPs truly allow a global and diverse perspective while making sure that the needs of BC learners are properly met. As an example, here's a picture of one of, 14 rural schools that I visited in Haiti in 2010. And this, as you can see, is probably the most destitute of the schools we visited. And yes, this is a whole school. There were 80 students there from the ages of 3 to 18, one principal and one teacher. In spite of the obvious challenges, and I guess I would like to note that the desks you see in this picture we had just brought there 2 days before. Prior to that, there were a couple of benches that were basically falling apart, and that was it. In spite of all the challenges that the educators faced here, but because they did have IRPs, and they followed a very rigid guideline of teaching protocols, they were able to meet and continue to meet the needs of the learners in this school on an educational basis. They also provide 2 meals a day, which for many of the kids was probably their primary source of nutrition. It just struck me as very powerful how one teacher and one principal, who obviously spent most of his time teaching, through following guidelines, were able to teach these kids and keep them moving on. I was lucky enough over the weekend, with the help of a couple of Canadian aid workers who just went back to Haiti, to Skype with the amazing power of the internet that we have now and a mobile access, with one of the students, my friend Caleb, who I met 2.5 years ago, and he's just finished grade 11 and he's going on to grade 12, and he attends a school, and he's a very intelligent and articulate young man who's doing very well. So we've seen that the IRPs can be very helpful in guiding a new teacher, and certainly in describing the prescribed learning outcomes and making sure that we as a new educator meet those for our students. And as an extreme example, as we just saw, even in the poorest country in the Western Hemisphere, which is Haiti, it's possible for a dedicated teacher to meet the needs of a class that is far larger and more diverse than what most of us will ever see in British Columbia. So there's a great power there in having defined PLOs. Unfortunately, our IRPs in BC contain a lot of definitions, a lot of different considerations for program delivery, but there's a real shortage of what makes a good lesson, and certainly an absolute shortage of engaging lesson plans. I find there's just a real lack of substance in the middle of the IRP, and in interviewing teachers in Victoria, of which I've talked to several specifically on this issue, and their response unambiguously was that after a couple years of teaching, they do not look at the IRPs except to glance at the PLOs to make sure that their lesson plans meet that. But imagine that, they don't even look at all these other dozens and dozens of pages that are provided in the IRP because they don't find them useful. As an analogy, while we were in Haiti, we managed to track down a couple of tarps with the great and kind help of some soldiers from Nepal, who led us to a police officer from Canada who knew where to get tarps, which weren't easy to find anyway, and we managed to throw a couple tarps on the roof so the kids weren't sitting in the rain and the mud because the rainy season was approaching. We did this outside of a 16-hour workday that we were all putting in. The BC IRPs, I think, are so restrictive and narrowly demanding that had we been following something like that, we would not have been able to get a tarp on the roof of the school. There's just no room for thinking outside of the box or for any kind of creative thinking within the IRP, which is a bit sad and ironic considering that the IRP is meant to engage BC learners. You would think it would allow more room for creativity on the part of an educator and a learner, and more room for thinking outside of the box to drive innovation in this province. The strength of the IRPs is in providing a condensed package of guidelines and outcomes that allow an educator and learners in the poorest of schools and in wealthier schools to meet the prescribed outcomes for each grade level and in each subject. Where the IRPs are greatly lacking is in allowing any creativity and in showing us as educators what does a good lesson plan look like? How do we engage our students? What does a unit look like that will really excite and engage our learners? And the IRPs are devoid in this area, and they greatly need improvement.